We've come to an end of a journey. This is the last episode in my series on the evolution of stone tools. Started off in Africa, close to 2 million years ago, with the old one technology. And we're now reaching the modern, quote-unquote, era. Modern in terms of stone tools, because after this period, we have metals now. I don't know what I'm going to do after this. I could do a lot of things, or I can just stop, but we'll see. The Neolithic is the period that now we're going to cover today. And starts with the end of the last ice age. What does the Neolithic mean? Well, the Neolithic is the new Stone Age. I'm sharing the screen because I should have done it before. Sorry about that. It is the culmination of a couple of million years of stone tool evolution, human evolution, and this period of time, by the end of it, we had completely revolutionized our way of life. And I don't mean this ironically. We actually completely changed our social structure and our power structure. But that is for another time. I'll just talk about them briefly just to explain the actual period. Now, as I said, the Neolithic is the new Stone Age. Paleolithic is Old Stone Age. That's what it means. Paleo is a Greek word for old, lithic, stone. Neo, new, lithic, stone, etc. And it's a period of development of human technology that began around 9,500 BC, or better still, around 1100 from the present time we have now. In Western Asia, this slide is a little bit antiquated, but I prefer to use the term Western Asia. Then it began with the rise of farming, which produced then the Neolithic Revolution, which I will just touch on. I've already sort of covered it, but I might do another series. Who knows? We will see. And it did end. This period of time ended with the metals that became widespread in the Copper Age, the Chalcolithic, and the Bronze Age. Now, at the beginning of the Neolithic, we still have these tools that were continuously from what I talked last week. Oops, I'm not sharing. Sorry about that, people. I hit the wrong button there. I'm sharing now again. The stone tools mainly continued from the earlier periods, which was the Magdalenian period in Western Europe, Southwestern Europe. But in all other parts, the stone tools were becoming smaller in size. They were becoming what I said last time, microliths. And continuing with bifacial microliths and other advanced techniques to produce them, to produce really sharp stone tools for all sorts of things, to shaft on shafts to make arrows or spears, etc. And they also, as I said, continued to use bone tools into much greater use, because now they are close enough to our time period that they are more preserved than they would have been if we go further back in time. As you can see here, again, I hit the wrong button, guys. I apologize. Here we see some more arrowheads, spear points, some blades, the general tool kit that continued on from just just before the end of the last glacial maximum. That is the period that we are covering now, because in the last episode we were at the point where the glaciers were melting. That's the hunting strategy had to shift because the megafauna was dying out, becoming extinct, and so there were the smaller animals like the smaller deer, the horse, and sheep and goats, and other smaller antelope species. So they had to develop new hunting techniques. Thus, we had the Magdalenian technology. There's similar technologies all over Eurasia and Africa, to that mirrored this development in ecological development. The game was getting smaller, of course. But then around the 11,000 to about 12 to about 10-ish thousand years ago, we had this sort of a small period where the temperature got cold again. It was called the Younger Dryas, and it's speculated that it was because in North America, the vast ice sheets had produced these enormous lakes. There was one that I know of that was in the western part of North America, and there was also one where the Great Lakes are now. The actual American Great Lakes are, and apparently around the 11, just by the time the end of the last glacial maximum, 12,500 years ago, sometime later, a couple of hundred years later, the ice wall that was holding back that water, fresh water, very cold fresh water, burst. And what was the result? Well, that cubic kilometers of water rushed into the North Atlantic, and it slowed or even stopped the Gulf Stream, and that's the stream that warms Europe. It begins in the Caribbean. It runs parallel to the coast of the east coast of North America, and it hits basically the United Kingdom and Europe with warm water, raising the temperature of about 4 to 5 degrees Celsius from normal. So that's what keeps us not as cold in winter as the equivalent latitudes in the Americas, North America I'm talking about. So we had the Younger Dryas, which sort of caused a weird sort of ecological shift in areas of Western Asia, what they call here Middle East, but it's Western Asia. It became areas where the climate was slightly drier, and there were sort of oases around springs and rivers, etc. And that seemed to have concentrated animals and humans in those small niches. And that what led to the later times domestication, but I'll cover that in a little while. Again, some more tools that are here, the common flakes, scrapers, burins, pounding tools, hammerstones. You can see them all here. And the periods that the Neolithic period was spread was not all at the same time. So like I said, the Fertile Crescent started around 12,000 to 9,000 years ago, not BC, years ago. While in North Africa, it sort of started around 8,000 years ago. So we'll add 2,000. No, the top one, but the Fertile Crescent is right. The other ones you have to add 2,000 years because these dates are not. This is just so you guys can get an idea of the periods around it. I'll correct them if they're why they're wrong, like I did. Europe around 6,000, 5,000 years BC. That is correct. The Africa, yeah, the same. 12, 14. No, 12,000 BC. 12,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago. 6,000 BC is correct. 8,000. 8 and 7,000 years ago in Europe. Southeast Asia again at 2,000 years from the from 2,000 years from the BC thing, and America around 4,100 BC. That's more or less correct. So the Neolithic didn't arrive at the same place at the same time. In all over the world, it arrived differently. And this is, you can see the expansion routes, possible expansion routes that we think that happened from Western Asia into Europe. And these dates are okay. Again, these more or less following excavations and dates for the appearance of basically the new Neolithic stone tools and other stuff which I'll discuss. Around around the beginning, just towards the middle of just before pottery was discovered, and there's two periods. There's a pre-pottery Neolithic A and pre-pottery Neolithic B. Pre-pottery Neolithic A, they use these type of tools. But then, 2,000 years later, around that, 1 or 2,000 years later, these sort of tools began to appear. And what are they? Well, they are basically polished tools, polished axes, polished implements. This is a new development in technology. What does it do, polishing for example, a hand axe? Well, it provides strength. You see, when you when you create a bifacial hand axe, or something. The right examples here, I apologize for not putting examples here, but you guys remember from the Acheulean hand axes and the other hand axes which I showed in my other series. They are bifacially flaked. They are bulbous at the bottom like these are, and they are chipped basically. You can see the chippings of the working them to make them as they were now. That induces a stress on the crystalline structure of the stone. But to get around that, if you polish it, you smoothen out those micro cracks, and you make the tool more robust, stronger, in fact. And that was the development that this new development in stone tool technology that made the axes, like these are, better suited to, for example, cut down trees. Before, even if you mounted one of the bifacial hand axes on a shaft, you were basically just gnawing at it like you were a beaver. Can you imagine a beaver biting around the tree log? This one, even though you're still sort of gnawing at the trunk, that the actual cuts are slightly deeper. So that is an advantage over the unpolished stone tools. But there's a downside to that. They take much longer time to produce them. They're more labor intensive. Here are a few more examples. And this is a possible way that they were mounted to provide greater leverage. If you add a lever to any implement, you amplify the force that you are applying to whatever you are using. So you with the hand axes of the Acheulean, the older ones, and later on up until Châtelperronian, Solutrean, etc., they did have hand axes. They weren't. There's no evidence that they were mounted, so they were held in the hand. But once you add a shaft like this is, a handle to it, you amplify the force it can be applied to that implement. That is an advantage that revolutionized the stone tools and the technology, and that's possibly why they took their time to polish them, because they knew that they had a more durable implement which they could apply greater force to whatever in its use. Then you got the last development of the stone tools. You get these hammer stones. These axes, hammer axes. As you can see, they perforated the stone. This was all done with stone tools, by the way. So they ground the hole into it. They polished it that way. This is the end product of millennia of stone working. You get something like this, these axes, which are works of art in themselves, yet they are highly effective. They could split a log almost as easy as a metal implement once you added the handle to it. In everyday living, you still had the bifacial daggers, but they were also mounted on shafts. You can see here some of the implements, some stone knives with handles to make them better to hold and also even amplify the force you could apply to them. You see here a comb down here, a scraper, some spear points or arrowheads, and you can see some of the flints on the side with some netting to hold the quivers, not quivers. What are they called? We put the knife in sheaves or something. I can't remember now. So never mind. So what happens in society? Well, the Neolithic people, because they were developing new forms of sustenance, basically getting their food. They firstly specialized in single type of games. We know from archaeological digs where there are areas which just specialize basically on one type of animal. Some were sheep, some were goats, and other antelope type, like chamois or ibexes, etc. Others were horses, and others were cattle or aurochs, the ancestor to all cattle. And at this time, people were beginning to settle down, become more sedentary, because apparently the places where they were settling down, they were so rich, these small oases, that they allowed them to stay longer without absolutely ruining the resources, because they were starting to harvest grain more than before. So they were they were specializing in one type of meat, but they were expanding the type of plants that they were eating. Lots of grains, some tubers, etc., etc. And this is possibly a scene which I like. I like this scene. It sort of shows a possible standard living day to day. You can see that they were. This would be much later, almost just before the settlement, the establishment of, say, small towns, and here there were still bands, so they were still extended families. They did not go into the next phase, the next level up, which is tribes, which are a group of extended family bands, which are related to one another in some way, language, culture, whatever. So this is the period. This would be pre-pottery Neolithic B. You can see that they were just about to possibly have invented the earliest stages of pottery production, and you can see some of the life activities that they would have had. The domestication of some animals, the planting of crops, tanning the hide, harvesting stuff, and producing what they needed, etc. Some animals that we knew that they domesticated, the cattle, the pigs, goats or sheep, and of course the dogs missing from here, but they would have had dogs also. So then we get into the phase of, after pre-pottery Neolithic B, we get into the phase of pottery production, and this revolutionized again, another revolution. It made the storage of their food stuff seeds mainly, and preserved or dried meats, etc. More viable because now they could seal them in watertight containers and conserve them, preserve them for a longer period of time. And that became, now you were producing an excess of food up until we're still in this phase where a famine, a bad year could wipe out the tribe, for example. But in the good years, they could produce enough excess of food that then would allow a change in their social structure, that they would allow artisans that did not need to produce food, and specialized people that did not need to produce food but sold their services. Maybe the potter sold his services, where he exchanged pottery for, because he was so good at it, making these awesome potteries like these ones, or this one, again, where he could sell these pots for food, etc. This then gave rise to someone, the leader of that tribe. Because now we've gone from bands, and we can now go into tribes, which, like I said, a tribe is not just a related band of family members, or even extended family members, or even one or two. Now they were a group of various bands cooperating together, which probably had common language, common culture. They knew each other, whatever. So they grouped together to form a tribe. That's the tier up from band. The lowest tier is band, after the individual or family members, of course. There's band, then there's tribes. So these are the periods that the social stratification, how it works. Then we get to what caused this change in social structure, the agriculture itself. The Neolithic period produced, as I said, due to the many factors, the concentration on one of a monotype of culture, hunting one type of animal. Someone may have said caught a calf that they killed a mother, and they said, "Oh, look at the calf! He's too young to kill because he won't give much meat. Let's take him back, put him in a pen they made from some reeds or some stuff, and magically that ungulate became tame." And so they sort of, that was possibly how domestication occurs. Now, agriculture itself, the domestication of plants, is slightly more different. Let's see if I have it here. Some of the stone tools that were developed during this time were the grinding rock slab and the grinding rock. These are to grind grains. And some of these, like as you can see, they have the axe, but also sickles. The bottom one is made of metal, so is the middle one, but the top one is not. That is made of stone, and they were to cut the grains, and then to grind the grinding stones, and to make the actual grinding the grains to make bread, which you can see on the side here. And these are the types of animals, plants that they would have been domesticating. And these were the wild wheat, the einkorn and emmer wheat. The problem with these is separating the grain from the plant itself, from the seed pod, quote unquote, because they are held together by a ligament thing that is quite strong. Now, while they were harvesting, due to natural what's that word? You know what? Damn it! What the X-Men are? I've got the word on top of my... Anyway, there were errors in the genetic code that made some of the grains not as well attached to the actual grain's head, And as they were harvesting, because they were using these type of sickles, these are these are single sickles. Mutation. Thank you, Modwine. That's what I was trying to think about. Thank you, man. That's what I was trying to think about. And the mutations led to some mutations led to there was a weakened the link between the grain and the seed pod head. So as they were harvesting, it would drop to the ground, and it would grow up later. So amplifying that mutation into easier to harvest when they were separating the seeds, because they would drop off naturally, more readily, not naturally, more readily, until we get to what we have now, which you have to be very careful when you're harvesting, or else the seeds just drop off. But getting to the domestication, sometime the people in that area realized that the seeds that they were falling to the ground, or that they remained there, would grow back the next year, because they were still semi-nomadic, even though they spent more time in one area. But they were still moved around in the territory, so they wouldn't exhaust their resources completely. Once they came back to the same area, they must have seen, oh look, that wheat's grown again. I wonder if it was because we didn't harvest all of it, or some other. Eventually, they would have figured out that if they deliberately planted it, some of the grains, the following season they would have had new patches of wheat, and that's how basically domestication of the grains occurred, and all over the place. Here's some more emma wheats. How you would see there's the yellow one. They knew that once it turned yellow, it would have been ready to harvest. So the green ones, etc. And that's it. That's it. So basically, just to summarize what happened in the Neolithic, they developed new technologies that could produce the stones that were ground into a smoother finish that made them more durable. It also then they were at the same time they were developing the new social structures, new social living way of living, that the agriculture allowed them to not just be totally dependent on gathering food, but the surpluses that were generated allowed some people to specialize in certain offices, like pottery making, basket weaving, the stone grinders, the ground the stones that produce the axes, etc., etc. And then that led later on to a specialization in fighting force, in government, etc., etc. And basically, agriculture led to everything that we have now. In fact, there's an article which I linked in the description of a Guardian article, which showed that agriculture initiated inequality, and they are correct. The only way socialism, communism, socialism works is in hunter-gatherers, because they had to depend on each other. They had to share. There was egalitarianism, pure egalitarianism. There was obviously looked towards a leader to give them advice, but they all that leader would be still dependent on the least capable person to survive, for example. And there's also the cases of not just Neanderthals, but Neanderthals, Erectus, Sapiens, where the empathy was evident in the archaeological record, where those bands, this is bands, not tribes in agriculture, these are bands of related individuals. They cared for their sick and elderly. So that basically ends. I'll stop this because I'm just showing my screen. It doesn't matter. I end this episode here. Hope you all enjoyed it. I'm not going to do metals. This is the end of the part of prehistory which I like. After metal, even though the metals and the ages in the metal ages are also extremely fascinating in them and by themselves. I like the prehistory, as you guys know, and maybe I don't know what I'm going to do next week. We will see how the weekend turns out. I hope I do something. If I don't do something, we shall see. So to answer some questions, Davey, how did we discover metal? Well, it was possibly this way: fires in the area that they were the Neolithic Revolution was taking place, where agriculture and domestication was taking place, and the settlements were becoming more settled. People were living sedentary lives. There were, of course, natural deposits of metals, copper, for example, the green. I don't know. I can't remember the mineral that gives you copper. It's green or blue, and possibly they made a fire on top of one of those, or they used some stone to line the heath, because that was common, with some with a rock that contained some of those minerals, copper minerals. And then the next day, sometime when they were cleaning out, they noticed this hard lump of stuff, and they picked it up. It would have been malleable. They could have bent it, and so on. And then natural human curiosity, they would have seen it and say, "Oh, this is interesting," and used this as a trinket, for example. And over time, they noticed that the same rock would produce those type of deposits in the heaths, and then they just basically went on from there, for example. Giovanni, yes, I have seen some videos about Skara Brae. That's one of the oldest Neolithic sites in the British Isles. It's way up north in Scotland, and it's not just that, but it was the scene of one of my favorite games when I had the Amiga, the Commodore 64, which was a Bard's Tale 3, and you always started off in Skara Brae. It was basically Lord of the Rings, but they couldn't use Lord of the Rings because it was licensed, so they called it Bard's Tale 3, 1, 2, and 3. And you started off in Skara Brae. That's how I knew about that archaeological site. And it's been excavated now for a long time. They started excavating. Vere Gordon Child, the one who coined the phrase Neolithic Revolution, where this period of Neolithic change occurred, he was one of the first people. He excavated it there. He studied Skara Brae. So it is interesting, but I have seen the videos. Yes, I've seen not just videos. I've seen some papers and some studies on that place. It's still very nice. It's 2,000 years earlier than the Neolithic deposits we have here. Basically, the megalithic tombs, which are metal aged, by the way. So 2,000 to 3,000 years earlier. So yes. Oh, I don't know. I might try. I might do a. I'm gonna write it down. I might. Yes, I'll see. That'll be a good thing to do. I'll just a note here. Thank you for that suggestion. I might. Who knows? So yes, that's about it. Yeah, been long enough. Thank you all for coming along, and we'll end it here. It's always a pleasure having you guys around, and hopefully see you next time. We will see if something occurs. If I see some studies, I've downloaded a couple today. I have to investigate them though, and then we'll see. Thank you all again, and good night.